This is Climate Watch. I'm Zhao Ying. Welcome to the show. The European Union has reached an agreement with Beijing on general guidelines regarding the pricing of Chinese electric vehicles. The move could potentially replace the punitive tariffs of up to 35.3% that have been in place since 2024. Days later, Canada announced it would allow up to 49,000 Chinese EVs to enter the country at a most favored nation rate of 6.1%. That's far below the 100% tariff imposed in 2024 that effectively halted imports. So today on Climate Watch, we ask, are countries finally prioritizing affordable decarbonization over a global trade war? Joining us now from Brussels is Arvea Marieni, European Climate Pact Ambassador. Arvea, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. My pleasure to be here.
First of all, can you explain to us what a minimum price undertaking exactly is, and how does it work in practice for a Chinese EV maker selling into Europe?
A minimum price undertaking is a tool, is an alternative trade policy tool or mechanism with which in the future Chinese electric vehicle makers will commit to sell their EVs on the European market above an agreed minimum price. And in return, the European Union, the Commission, will not be imposing anti-subsidy tariffs that have been decided on these imports earlier, with a value up to 35% varying on the specific automaker. What happens in practice is that the Commission has basically published a guidance on how the exporters can put forward this price undertaking offers. So the single automaker will make an offer to the Commission, including this minimum import price for each specific model and configurations of the type of vehicle sold. And the European Commission, based on what they consider as a fair price to offset what they consider a subsidy advantage, will decide whether to accept it or not. And as a consequence, and that is the advantage to the EV is produced in China, is that the tariffs that were previously decided by the Commission will not apply it. Obviously, there will be several criteria, including price and structure, distribution, but also, and we will see it later, investments in the European Union. What also happens here is that the money, let's put it this way, the extra margin that is between the sale price and the minimum price will not go to the Commission or to the European Union, not to the EU government, unlike what happens with trade tariffs, but stays with the company. The last point I would like to make, and that is this is a special case for this particular application of a tool that is normally applied to commodities rather than on manufactured goods like cars, especially complex ones.
Okay, so why is the European Union choosing this approach now? And when you look at this decision, do you see it primarily as a climate move or as a political and industrial one?
I actually think that the response is both. Why? Because we have come to a point whereby industrial policy is an essential element of how to design the fundamental rules of trade, economic development, manufacturing and production within different regional economies. And this affects the way we operate our economies, and this is the implementation phase of principles that have been set in stone and in the international agreements and in the law. Why is the European Union choosing this approach? This is definitely a trade and industrial strategy, and is trying to also balance the need to rebalance the local competitiveness capacity to compete on international market that the European automaking industry, the automakers, have been losing over the last, or comparatively losing over the past couple of decades. And this has seen an increase of competitiveness within the Chinese manufacturing industry with automotive for a number of reasons that are only partly connected to subsidies or industrial policy, but they are very much connected to a specific forward-looking model of investment, early stage investment, roughly started in 2010, into new sectors that everyone globally knew, and Paris was just a couple of years later in 2015, was going to be the future of the automotive industry. However, the Europeans were resisting this transition and the major investments in the new manufacturing lines or the components or the OEMs, because fundamentally this is a technology that was like blue ocean technology to be completely developed, new supply chains, and this was relatively easier for a country that did not have immobilization in investments in large investment plans that needed to come to their end of life, which is the case, for instance, for the Europeans. The main drivers today to coming to a decision to agree on this compromise, I would say, that has been welcomed by both parties, by the Chinese government, the MOFCOM, and the European Commission, is also geopolitical, because we are seeing that there is a growing sense of geopolitical conflict, unfortunately. And there is also a growing sense that energy independence, especially energy independence from fossil fuels, is becoming a fundamental key element for competitiveness and resilience, but also for strategic autonomy. Therefore, there is also a tendency at the moment to try to look for common interests with partners internationally, including China, that might have the same converging interests. Energy independence is important for both China and the European Union. Acceleration of industrial development for decarbonization of end use and electrification of end uses such as mobility is a common interest, enshrined both in the Chinese and the European law. But we also need to balancing market access and protecting the capability of automakers in the EU to remain on the market, even though largely this lack of competitiveness is a consequence of our own choices. And we also are preparing a more balanced level playing field that is going to be applied not to an entire sector, but negotiating solutions that are tailored company by company. And this will reflect in the end also the structure of the automaker industry, the automobile industry within China itself, whereby you got a large number of companies that are very different in their competitivity and capability to be and react to price and technology advancements. So there are climate objectives that are connected to the fact that you need to make electric vehicles affordable and largely taken up by the population, accelerating this curve. We see that this year in 2026, in the first weeks, basically, for the first time, the purchase of non-traditional internal combustion engines is being higher in the European Union. In China, new energy vehicles are already above 50% of new sales. China is advanced, but we need to really push forward and accelerate in the common interest.
Well, as you said, with tariffs, the governments collect the money, but with price undertakings, the companies keep the higher price. Why do you think the EU would be willing to give up significant tariff revenue in exchange for this model?
Look, the competition is difficult for the European automakers because we are lagging behind in terms of technology, the battery supply chain, but also the software, the digital connectivity, which is also a very important element of this new concept of transition. But this is also dependent on the fact that because the industrialization and the engineering and the acceleration in China, not only because of subsidy, it has been very significant. Chinese automakers have got very significantly lower prices that the Europeans cannot match. And also the Europeans have been investing in larger vehicles, trying to supplement their margins. Industries have not invested enough in renewing their supply chains. They've tried to focus on how to make money on the short term. Why is the EU willing to let's say, give up, as you said, these revenues? Well, for the simple reason that we want to continue to supplement and maintain industrial capacity within Europe, also for a question of protecting jobs, but also because it is essential for maintaining regional competitiveness and industrial supply chains that would be gone. Now, that is a case that can be made, that we are somehow keeping on pouring money in industries that have decided to choose a losing pathway. And I think that is a criticism that can be made referring to the European industry. However, we also have to be realistic, and we have to find a way for balancing all these different policy priorities.
Okay, but I mean, from a climate perspective, does it matter where that money ends up? Because I mean, if the government has that revenue, they can use it for like building infrastructures or charging stations. But now, is this essentially a choice between public climate financing and private climate investment?
I do not really want to frame it this way, because the reality is that we need huge flows of both public finance and private investment, and that the transition will be doable in China and in the European Union only as long as societies can go along with it and see the benefits. And erasing the industrial capability within the European Union or making life less affordable to citizens is actually not supporting a possible transition. And we see the backlash in Europe. We see the backlash and the challenge that the Commission is facing while trying to accelerate the implementation of climate objectives, to the point today that there is a call for broad simplification that is actually not broadly in line with our set laws in terms of both environmental and climate regulations. And this compromise, let's put it this way, allows for creating the conditions for maintaining the industry, maintaining the jobs, maintaining also the margins that allow for profitable operations of industrial companies, but also lower the price of EVs on the internal market, because thanks to these price offers coming from the Chinese EV makers, unavoidably vehicles will become more affordable and prices will go down in Europe as well. And this will be another contribution of cooperation. We have probably to frame this agreement as a step in the right direction of competitive cooperation towards common trade redesign objectives. We need to make trade more climate compliant, and this is a way to do that.
Okay, and as you mentioned earlier, this guidance says the EU will consider Chinese companies' future investments in Europe. Is this just about climate and jobs, or is this also a strategic way to pull advanced battery and EV manufacturing onto European soil? Because, you know, the EU has long criticized forced technology transfer, but is it now essentially doing the same, like using market access to encourage Chinese firms to bring their most advanced capabilities into Europe?
Well, I wish to remind that after 78, one of the main tenets of China joint venture policy was to foresee a 51% majority from a local partner. And I've been claiming already some time ago, even before the Commission would move towards this more pragmatic approach, when there were calls for real decoupling, even more than de-risking, I was calling for some sort of taking up of the Deng Xiaoping's page on investment and trade for the European Union. And I think the latest trip of President Macron of France that highlighted this same approach, Macron was calling for investments in the European Union, is very realistic, because today there has been a sort of a shift in relation to what was the situation 30, 40, 50 years ago. We were dominating entire technology sectors. By saying we, let's say traditional Western operators. And nowadays, innovation has happened and has consolidated, and engineering has allowed for industrial scale up and market uptake in China. We now are lagging behind in relation to China in very many technologies that are critical for the common transition. Therefore, it is important that we consolidate this capability also in Europe. I think it is in the interest of China, and I think that the fact that the Chinese government has happily welcomed this compromise is a recognition that there is not going to be, even for China, a possibility to move forward, not only on climate policy, but consolidate and restructure the international set of rules that has allowed to govern international trade and globalization in a common vision for the past 80 years after the Second World War, then specifically after the 90s. So I think it is a very important thing. And we also need to consider that as much as China highlights the importance on reducing dependence on imports, the Chinese government is taking very serious and very consistent steps towards national autonomy and resilience in many sectors. And this is strategic autonomy. We also in the European Union have to start building up that strategic autonomy. And that has always been my position, not only towards China, facing China, but also other international partners.
Okay, actually, we know that Chinese EV investments in Europe are already happening, like the factories in Hungary. How are they doing right now, and how do such kind of localized production support the EU's green transition?
It is very important, and as you describe it very well, there is a restructuring within the European market itself. Basically, there are being newcomers in relation to older and more traditional car making, producing countries. I mean, the lead role was Germany. We have seen in the last years that production and facilities are moving towards countries whereby, for instance, Spain or Hungary, there has been a significant investment in clean energy. So the localization of renewable energy capacity is also important for the future competitiveness. Hungary has invested in a very consistent manner with a full supply chain approach, integrating long distance railways, battery production with CATL, and the full components of this transition. And Volkswagen is going to produce significant numbers of EVs in Hungary, while it is closing down some factories in Germany. The Audi plant is already closing down in Brussels. Hungary is actually celebrating new investments. And this is because Budapest is positioning itself as one of the main centers for the future European car and battery production. BMW has invested 2 billion to build a new plant in Debrecen for the next generation of vehicles. BYD is active in Hungary with e-bus production, which is also a very important part of the market, of the mobility market. And both facilities actually started operations already in 2025. And this is really a consequence of this industrial strategy, focus strategy on electric vehicles that has been a characteristic of the Chinese policy planning, starting very early in 2010 and creating also market by means of public procurement. If I think that there was a clear mandate, for instance, for Shenzhen, which was identified very early as the beacon of these new industrial capabilities for the whole supply chain to actually replace the traditional public transportation means that were internal combustion engines with EVs, and that at a time where the efficiency of batteries was much lower than today. So the decision of early investments and also the capability of the Chinese government to decide to assume, to accept some cost and some burden of investments for creating and strengthening the technology is paying now, is paying back now. So this is also why I think in a way, yes, it is true, it is industrial policy, it is true there is a level of subsidies, but in some ways we can also think that the Chinese consumer, the Chinese taxpayer, it has also started contributing to lowering the price of consumption in Europe. And is in some ways, if we want to stretch it, this is a position that some share is also subsidizing the European market.
Yes, but I am thinking if climate change is a collective action problem, does it even make sense for countries to compete so fiercely over who gets to manufacture green technologies and argue about this kind of subsidies? Shouldn't we just let people buy the EVs at lower prices that they can afford? And to what extent do you believe protecting domestic industry could somehow undermine the very climate goals those industries are supposed to serve?
I would like to answer by quoting Commissioner Teresa Ribeira when she was the Competitiveness Commissioner, Teresa Ribeira, when she was basically in front of Parliament at the moment of the start of her work. She made it clear during this confirmation hearing that there are these new global competitors emerging. We face challenges and those must be solved. They cannot be solved by shutting markets alone because the challenges we face are common, but we cannot accept as European obviously to completely deindustrialize. However, business as usual is also not acceptable. And she was already mentioning that we would have to rethink some of our traditional tools and how to ensure that these tools are fit for these new, very harsh market realities. And Europe requires these transformative investments that align decarbonization and competitiveness for building the industry that are the future industries. And this is also set in two very important reports that have created a lot of dialogue discussions in Europe, the Draghi report and the Letta report about how to increase the European competitiveness. The last point I want to make, yes, in an ideal world, and this is happening, for instance, in the global south, whereby Chinese-made technologies, not only for power generations, but even EVs, are largely taking up market shares simply because they are good products at a low price. And that should happen automatically if the world was led by amity, by cooperation, by friendly agreements among states. The problem is that there is competition and that we are also trying to maintain certain living standards within a very difficult and resource-constrained world. What we need to do is also being able to create the conditions, and this is by creating the rules of the game together, not only with China, but also with international partners that allow every partner to maintain a livable condition.
Well, we see Volkswagen's Cupra Tavascan, which is manufactured in China, it is seeking these price undertaking exemptions. Is it ironic that the first win for this deal might go to a European brand rather than a Chinese one like BYD or Geely?
It is simply a question of market realities. Until not long ago, European producers, automakers were actually leading the sales. And in China, there has been a shift in consumption choices made by the Chinese consumers. And they simply don't buy European EVs because those are at the moment not yet matching their needs. In many ways, as we say, there are still differences in efficiency or in the models or in the connectivity, which is a very important part of the new product. The old vehicles, the old automotive concept of the car is probably going to disappear in the future. And Volkswagen is producing in China. And actually this compromise is not obviously, there is some level of irony. However, this compromise is, I think, and I repeat it, the best way forward. And other Chinese automakers will be able to do exactly the same. Among those, BYD is very well placed and it will harvest the advantages. There is another positive factor for the Chinese market and players, because at the moment there is a very harsh competition in China. This competition is making also these companies suffer. And many of these companies will be either consolidated or simply disappear. By raising the price, the sale price in Europe, this will allow these companies also to find space to breathe and to collect some money for invest more in China, for increasing their R&D capability and to continue to move forward.
Yeah, those fierce competition that has somehow accelerated innovation but also put pressure on profits, this is being framed as involution in China. So do you mean that Europe's price-based approach might unintentionally help China deal with this problem?
Well, I think that when the word involution is used in China, is generally reflecting a sort of understanding of a slowing down of the development of the quantitative elements of the economy. I would like to challenge this idea for a moment, because the reality is that if we are moving collectively, not only China, if we are serious about moving collectively and globally towards an economy that is operating within planetary boundaries, that means that necessarily the quantity of goods produced will be decreasing. If you think of international trade, and that applies to trade, by the way, if you think of international trade, direct numbers like 30% of the shipping operations globally, just the direct shipping operations, not the indirect effects, 30% of it will disappear because ships are currently moving fossil fuels, coal and everything. And this has not to be there anymore. There are entire commodities, classes of commodities that are not simply compatible with an economy which is ecologically designed. And in a way, what is happening in China is very interesting, because the idea of this huge societal transformation is led by the reduction of an intensity of resource usage and moving towards a more service-oriented high quality type of production and consumption. Obviously, China is setting itself as a sort of a pilot for something that is a complete revolution of the way we even conceive not only industry, but also the economy and trade. And of course, China is anticipating part of this and factoring in and leaving already part of this, let's say, difficult to manage effects of this transformation. And obviously, there is not yet a full-blown design on how you create margins, create benefits that are distributed through profits across the industries and going to the citizens. But I think this is eventually the way that we all need to take globally. And I give you an example. An Italian leading economist who has been also an advisor to the government of Mario Draghi, the former governor of the European Central Bank, has analyzed trade flows starting from 2020. So obviously there was an impact of the pandemic, but what is happening globally, and this is also a consequence of the mainstreaming, the integration of climate and environmental KPI, is that flows external to the European Union are relatively decreasing. Obviously, it is a generalization. And the internal trade flows among the member states of the European Union are increasing. What does it mean? It means that in the future, we will see certain unavoidable trade flows happen between regions. And this must remain. And we have to find a way to really support and make it doable and profitable for everybody. But a lot of the trade as we know it, if we are successful in moving towards a climate neutral economy, will simply disappear.
Yeah, and actually in the meantime, Canada is also working on resolving such kind of tariff dispute. It went from a 100% tariff to allowing tens of thousands of Chinese EVs at a much lower rate. Is this just a coincidence, or do you believe we're seeing US allies seeking some alternative approach?
It is absolutely so. I would also say that, in my opinion, what is happening is also a reflection of two kinds of evolution and model of society and model of economy. The United States, like the European Union and unlike China, are one of the leading exporters of fossil, for instance, especially for LNG, fracking. And on the top of it, the entire industry and structure of the United States is fossil dependent. Financial flows are fossil dependent. Investments are fossil dependent. China is positioning itself towards becoming an electro state with a huge acceleration of the building up of renewable capabilities and capacity, production capacity, and further replacement of fossil production and the electrification of end uses. And this is creating two really different competing visions of the future of the world. And this is probably also part of the accentuated conflicts that are rising among these traditional economies that are fossil dependent. Russia basically has a relatively simple economic structure with its export capabilities completely dependent on energy, on traditional energy. I think that this bet on the future of competition and the future of resilience and the future of our own position as well as Europeans is on the capacity that we have today to embrace and consistently bring forward the transition. And yes, Trump, this administration is actually accelerating certain analysis and considerations even within the European Union, because we have come to a point whereby we either decide that we stand for us, for ourselves as a unity, a single market, defending the Brussels effect, which is the fundamental capacity of Brussels through regulation to determine also what sort of trade we want to have and also what sort of standards we want to have. Obviously, this is never going to be either or choice. The states and the European Union has interests. And we will have to find ways, as Mark Carney said in Davos, to assert these interests in a reasonable and cooperative manner with different configurations at international level, trying every time to pull together coalitions that are of states that are going in the same direction. And I want to close really with the last consideration. We were in Belém for the COP30 in November, and there were certainly all the pressures and contradictions and tensions within the European Union slowing up our position, the negotiating position. And there was all the international pressure created also by the decisions of the Washington administration. Well, we can say that the agreement with which COP30 ended, certainly not perfect, but at least we're moving forward, was also facilitated by the parallel G20 in South Africa. And there we saw something very important. In spite of the demands of the US government, the international community represented by the G20 reaffirmed the principles of the UNFCCC, reaffirmed the principles of transition pathways, and reaffirmed that the world stands for finding cooperative solutions and not moving towards conflict.
Thank you, Arvea Marieni, European Climate Pact Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And that wraps up this edition of Climate Watch. You can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platforms. Just search for Climate Watch and hit subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. You can also email us at radio@cgtn.com with your questions or feedback. And stay updated on the latest climate stories with our Substack newsletter, Climate Choices. I'm Zhao Ying. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.